It's hard to believe that we've reached a point in time where you can buy a used, beautiful, top trim level Tesla Model S for under $20,000, but that's exactly where we are. You see, when this car came out, it was truly groundbreaking. It offered beautiful styling, over 300 miles of range, and over 400 horsepower. It was truly the first electric vehicle that you could use in place of a gasoline counterpart with little to no compromise. And most importantly, it was the first electric vehicle that was not designed to mimic a hard-boiled egg. Cars at the time like the Fisker Karma, Nissan Leaf, and Chevy Volt were all vehicles that attempted to bridge the gap between gasoline and electric, but unfortunately they were unable to cross the water. The Tesla Model S, however, cracked the code to being the first vehicle that you can truly use every day that was driven by an electric powertrain. It had only one problem. Long-range models of the Tesla Model S started at over $80,000 and over $90,000 for the performance trim level that you see right here. This made the very idea of owning an electric vehicle cost prohibitive to most buyers, since the whole point of owning one is to save money on gas. So the fact that these vehicles had an astronomical price tag just didn't make them all that practical. After years of depreciation and numerous cases where the brand has come under fire for questionable build quality on their vehicles, we've reached a point where you can find a used Tesla Model S between $15,000 to $20,000. That is extremely affordable, especially for a high-tech electric car like this one. But the question remains, should you buy a decade-old Tesla Model S? First off, I wanted to start on the exterior of the Model S, and I have to say that when this car came out, it was simply stunning. I mean, it offered a low-slung profile with clean, sweeping lines and an overall beautiful contemporary aesthetic. And I'm happy to say that this design has held up extraordinarily well over time, and it still looks modern to this day. This is helped by the fact that despite being introduced over a decade ago, the Tesla Model S has not received a full exterior redesign since its inception. Now, of course, there have been minor tweaks and updates here and there, but to the untrained eye, all Tesla model years look fairly similar. This means that despite its age, it still looks modern even today. Next, I wanted to touch upon the build quality of the Model S, which I'm sure is the most pressing question on buyers' minds when considering purchasing over a decades-old Tesla. And I have to say that somehow I feel like these earlier Model S's suffered from less of those panel gaps that we've been known to see on the newer ones. If I look around this car, everything has held up over time incredibly well just on an eye-level sort of overview. No major panel gaps on the exterior. Everything fits as it should, and there aren't really that many creaks or rattles when driving the vehicle around. Now, on the other hand, one thing I wanted to touch on is the questionable choice of materials that are featured on this car. Obviously, we'll see more of that when we get onto the interior, but one of the major problems with these Model S's are the door handles. Now, I'm pretty sure that Tesla has come up with some revised renditions of these door handles over time, but these earlier ones are extremely prone to failures, braking, glitches. You know, you'll be in situations where all of a sudden one of them won't retract, or the electronic mechanism goes out. You'll be driving around and have it do all sorts of weird things. And I can't even say to myself my own head the number of times that the door handles on this car have broken, and it's definitely a costly fix. Coming around back, that same theme about questionable materials continues. Now, we do have this nice electronic lift gate here, and as you see, it actually didn't work. That was not planned. I don't know why. But if we go ahead and open it, we will see that on these hatch struts that we have some rust formation, like on the mechanisms here, and also on this side. So it's not unique to one side. This seems to be a reoccurring theme. And that is just kind of symbolic of, I feel, the lack of quality on materials used around the car. Now, at this time, Tesla was using a lot of materials that were shared with Mercedes-Benz, so I can't necessarily say that this is 100% their fault, but I just thought it's something I'd mention. We'll go ahead and close that. And then another thing I want to talk about while we're back here is the charge port. This is another finicky item on these earlier ones that sometimes it opens. There have been constant problems with it where the magnet falls out, all sorts of things. Perhaps they've been solved on newer models, but on these older ones I know for sure that the charge port can cause some issues for people. Finally, before we head on to the interior of the Model S, I wanted to touch upon the wheel and suspension choices available on these earlier cars. Now, the wheels on this particular model are the 19-inch wheels, but these cars were also offered with a 21-inch turbine wheel that is very sleek and attractive, but I would highly discourage buyers who are located on maybe the East Coast or areas of the country where there are rougher roads or winters that require snow tires. Number one, it's very hard to find a winter tire for that wheel size, and number two, those wheels are extremely prone to damage and cracking on rougher road surfaces like potholes, cracks, stuff like that. And also the tires are very susceptible to damage as well because of their low sidewall or their limited sidewall. So anytime you hit a bump or a large pothole that would be absorbed by the 19-inch wheels, chances are that's going to go all the way to the rim and either crack the rim, create a bubble in the tire, or just flat you right on the spot. Next, let's talk about suspension. Now, these were offered with two suspensions from the factory. You have the coil spring suspension or the air suspension, which is featured on this car. Now, there are pros and cons to both. The pros of the coil spring suspension is that it's extremely robust relative to the air suspension. It will hold up better over time, but the drawbacks of it are that the ride will be firmer and you cannot adjust the ride height or feel. Now, this one has the air suspension, and the benefits there are an extremely comfortable ride and a very cool system that the car uses where it memorizes steep driveways or rough roads, and you can program it to automatically raise the suspension and lower the suspension in those respective areas. So let's say you're out cruising on the highway at 90 miles an hour, the car knows that, so it will lower you to the ground to make you more aero and increase your center of gravity on the road. If it knows you're approaching your house, where you might have a steep driveway, it will raise the suspension, make it almost have the ground clearance of like a small SUV. So that's a very cool feature. But the problem with air suspensions is over time their reliability becomes questionable. A few years ago, the air suspension on this Model S actually went out after the owner whacked a large pothole and the entire rear end of the car collapsed. They were forced to limp home, dragging the tires on the undercarriage of the car, and it ended up costing several thousands of dollars to replace just the rear air suspension. So I feel like I can't really put myself in a position to recommend the air suspension to people, although it is a pretty cool, nifty feature. Next up, here on the interior, we're exposed to an area of the car that hasn't withstood the test of time quite as well as the exterior has. I mean, there is some minor wear and tear on this interior, like some wear on the seats, questionable materials like loose panels, and wear on the console here. Of course, a vehicle that's over a decade old is expected to have some wear on the interior, but I also have seen many vehicles hold up much better over this same time span. So I'm thinking that it's just a combination of kind of wear and tear and also just poor quality materials in here. With that being said, it's not terrible. The interior is still presentable. It's just when you get up close and personal with it, there is some wear. Next, I wanted to touch upon the actual technology in here, and there is some cracking going on the screen here in the center display and also in this main touchscreen that controls all the functions in the vehicle. Now keep in mind, this vehicle hasn't been in any impacts, there have been no collisions, so brute force hasn't caused these cracks. The only thing that I can reason in my head is that the heating and cooling cycles, here on the East Coast, it could be 20 degrees in the winter or it could be 100 degrees in the summer. So those constant heating and cooling cycles may have just gotten these screens to the point where they succumbed to those forces and ultimately cracked. But it is kind of concerning, owning this car and being like, hey, why are my screens cracking out of nowhere? So that is something I wanted to bring to your attention. And then another thing is the actual performance. Now, a lot of times when you get in this car, it can be a little finicky. Sometimes it fires up right away. Other times you have to put your foot on the brake for 30 to 40 seconds for this center command system to boot up and allow you to actually drive the car. So that could be very frustrating. You know, you own this expensive electric car. Why do I have to hold my foot on the brake pedal for like a minute to get it to start up? Once it's up and running, everything works as it should. Same thing can be said about the center touchscreen. Everything on there still works, but after years and years of software upgrades, you know, the technology eventually will supersede the capabilities of this decades-old instrument cluster. Now, all these things can be retrofitted, and that's the cool thing about the Tesla, is that it operates on these technological systems. So any problem that really presents itself, you can swap in the newer hardware if you really wanted to. It actually is pretty impressive just how well it's held up. I mean, when was the last time that you fired up an 11-year-old laptop in your house and everything still works the same way it did when it left the showroom? My MacBook that I purchased several years ago can only browse the internet, okay? Forget about doing anything else. So the fact that this whole car is still operational is pretty impressive, all things considered. Lastly, and perhaps the biggest question mark with these electric vehicles, is how has the battery held up? And the answer is quite simple. So far, so good, but time will tell. Now, the owner hasn't noticed any significant degradation on this battery, and that's been achieved by following Tesla's protocol of not charging the battery fully unless you're going on a long trip. Things like that have been shown to expand the longevity of the battery, but the owner will continue monitoring how the battery is holding up and continue to push the car to its limits and cross that bridge of battery degradation when they get there. And once they do, it'll kind of be interesting to see, number one, how much it would cost to install a new battery pack on this Tesla, and if it would even be worth it. Now all that's left to do is get this Model S out on the road and find out how and why it has been so pivotal in changing the automotive landscape over the last decade. Let's find out. All right, here we are behind the wheel of the Tesla Model S, and I just can't stress to you how important and how incredible this car was when it came out. You know, I was a little kid, I used to watch Consumer Reports all the time, and I remember when this came out, no one had ever seen anything like this car. You know, electric cars at the time were always like kind of a secondary thought to gasoline. It was like people who owned an electric car usually had like 3 other gasoline cars, and the electric car was kind of like a novelty. You couldn't really use it. They all looked really stupid. And then this came out, the Model S, and Consumer Reports was testing it, and they're like, wait a second, this is the best car we've ever tested. It was the first car to score a 100 on their rating system. Now keep in mind, amazing cars on their rating system would score like, you know, 65 or something. Like, they were like the American Idol of like car ratings. It'd be extremely difficult to do well on their testing, and here came this car from a manufacturer no one had really heard about. A brand new car at its first year was just the best car they had ever tested. And you know, I heard from all the magazines and stuff, all those channels that I watched, that this car was just groundbreaking. So, you know, it was just super cool to see it come out. No one had really seen technology like this before. I mean, a full screen display that was bigger than an iPad to control every function of the vehicle. Also, the center electronic display having the map up there, something that we see a lot of nowadays in cars like Audis and stuff like that. But back then it was simply unheard of. And also just the styling of the car. You know, electric cars are usually so ugly, and I don't know why, but they still are. Like, most manufacturers, they're like, oh, we're gonna build an electric car, let's make this as ugly as possible, and as like no one would ever want to buy this. Like, let's make it look like that, like as ugly as we can possibly think about. Like, we'll take an ugly gas car and make it even uglier. But that wasn't the case with the Tesla. When it came out, it was beautiful for any car, possibly the most beautiful car on sale when it came out. And that's why I think this design has withstood the test of time so well. It still looks great. And this interior is so clean. It was a relatively interesting concept of going with like a minimalist approach of like nothing on the doors, you know, everything is controlled on this center touchscreen, so when the car is off, it really looks like there's nothing on the interior. There's only 2 buttons on the interior, and that's the hazard and the glove box. Even the glove box is electronically actuated. Also, the range that it possessed, over 300 miles, very much made it possible to drive every day. Whereas other cars like the Leaf had trouble, you know, getting over 100 miles of range, and that was really a deal breaker for people. And then also the performance. I mean, this car outperformed all the gasoline cars when it came out. I mean, 415 horsepower, it's a pretty healthy figure, but in an electric car you get that instant torque, no shifting, it's a 1-speed direct drive transmission. So all that power just went straight to the wheels. Unbelievable acceleration. Still to this day, you can out-accelerate anyone in your path. You know, it's simply incredible what this car offered at the time, and frankly still does all these years later. It's really impressive how well it's held up. Now, obviously, I mentioned some issues with the door handles and the interior quality. Those are all things that people kind of know about Tesla, things that you might expect when getting into one. But what you should also understand is that Tesla got a lot of things right on this car. You know, they weren't going to be the first company to produce this amazing electric car and have it be totally crap. So the drivetrain seems to be quite solid and seems to have held up quite well over the lifespan of the car. No major issues there. All the issues with these cars tends to be like the little things that are more pertain to like quality. The driving experience of the car is unchanged from the way it was new. It's incredibly quiet. There's zero noise when you accelerate. The tire noise is incredibly minimal, and because of the aerodynamic prowess of the car, the wind noise is almost non-existent. So you're basically cruising in this silent missile. It's pretty cool, and one of the cool things about these earlier Teslas is that they don't have any warning sound. So the new Teslas, because they are so quiet, have to make like a whoo, like when they back up. But these earlier ones, that wasn't mandated yet. So these are pretty unique in the fact that when you back up, they're completely silent. I think that's pretty cool. It's really cool to see how well Tesla did right out of the gate with this car. It's not often that we see vehicles from manufacturers that have very little experience and just excel on the first try. It's pretty rare to see. Usually, I mean, companies like Chevy and Chrysler still can't figure it out over 100 years. So the fact that they got so much done right on this car is pretty impressive. So we're here driving on this road. It's pretty quiet. Now, there have been some, you know, issues here and there. Like, as of right now, the suspension is a little finicky. It's this issue with the sway bar end links and stuff up front, which you know, is fairly common for a car of this age and mileage, but it is something that I've heard other people having similar issues with their suspension, so it definitely seems like a common trend. Maybe something that you would see a little bit later on other cars, something that might be a little bit premature on the Teslas, just having those suspension components wear out. As far as a used car purchase goes, I think these used Tesla Model S's make a lot of sense, more so than a Model 3, because you know, with the Model S you get the benefit of it being the flagship model, full size. People take better care of these because they are, you know, the premium offering from Tesla. Additionally, they're far more practical than the Model 3. They have a beautiful hatchback with 60/40 folding split seats. The Model 3 is more of a traditional sedan, so you can't get that practicality, you know, of having that pass-through in the trunk. It's just a bigger car, drives more substantially. For the value you're getting, it makes a lot of sense. Now, I know I've mentioned quite a few problems with the car, but when you consider the fact that this car is between $15,000 to $20,000, it makes a lot of sense with how much money you're going to be saving on gas. Also, if you're buying a car of this age and mileage, you're assuming that the owner has probably encountered most of these issues already and has fixed them. So all the expenses are out of your way because they've already been experienced by the previous owner. So it kind of makes sense to buy a Model S in that time frame. once the previous owner has dealt with all those things. And I would be much more inclined to buy one of these used over like a similar luxury car like a Mercedes S-Class. You know, quite frankly, these electric vehicles have a lot less moving parts. So yes, things do break on the Tesla, but generally they're usually superficial things like the door handles, interior trim, whereas on Mercedes or other German luxury brands, things like that, you can have major mechanical failures that auto shops will charge extra to fix because it's, you know, a high-end car. It's just not worth going through the trouble of that. Much rather purchase one of these used Model S's. I think it's a cool phenomenon that we're experiencing right now in the electric car market, having these vehicles that were once super expensive being available for very cheap, and just seeing how they're going to hold up over time. Obviously, there's a lot of uncharted territory regarding the you know, batteries, how those are going to hold up. So it's just going to be interesting to see. I think these used Teslas can be a great purchase as long as you're smart with the buying process. Look for the right one that's been taken care of, something that's had most of the major issues sorted out. And yeah, I think it could be a great used car for someone and very affordable. So with that being said, I hope you all enjoyed the video. As always, I had fun making it, and I look forward to the next one. Peace.